Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream by entering this virtual meeting room. You give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Vienna Live with Simeon Moore and other third parties. If you wish to not be recorded, please go to the LinkedIn Live video feed, the link to which I have just placed in the chat room. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by making comments and asking questions. To do so, please either write in the chat room or turn on your microphone and say hi. We'll be delighted to include you in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guests are Philip Ewell, University Professor for Music Theory at Hunter College in New York City, and Julio Mendívil, University Professor for Ethnomusicology at the University of Vienna. Welcome, Professor Ewell.
Hi, great to see you, Simeon. Thanks for having me.
Professor Ewell, so please tell us about the story of your first encounter with racism in higher education.
So I thought about that a little bit, and in higher education, it's kind of difficult. I actually would like to put the focus on the word racism, if I could, in your question. I could go back and say in higher education in fifth grade, that was the first time somebody called me to my face, Nigger. I won't say the word, but that person said the word. They didn't spell it out the way that I just did. So maybe that's the first time. Fifth grade, I would have been maybe 10 years old, right? But actually, I'd like to speak just for a minute, if I could, about the word racism, because the word racism is actually it very much functions in service of white supremacy. So I very much take issue with using the word racism. It's something I very rarely say myself. You'll never hear me say racist. It's a way for white supremacist structures on planet Earth to put all types of anti-otherness racism in a basket. So obviously anti-black racism, that's what concerns me. My father was black. My mother was actually from Norway. So I'm a mixed race person. But anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, in Austria, anti-Turk, right? Or anti-Roma, anti-Romani. There's a lot of that there. Goodness, Austria, they wrote the book on anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Jewish thought. Anti-indigenous here in the United States, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, right? I like to speak very specifically about a certain type of racism. And the reason I do that is because the word racism is everything and it is nothing at once. And it serves to help white structures muddy the waters. It's very unclear if we simply say, what's racism? What was your first experience with racism? And to which I would actually say, what type of racism are we talking about here? Now, if we're talking about anti-black racism, sure, I could talk about the first. I've been called Nigger to my face 3 times in my life, and surely countless times behind my back as well. But generally speaking, things concerning me are anti-black in nature, and that goes for over 400 years now in the legacy of anti-black racism through our legacy of chattel slavery.
Wow. Professor Mendívil, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Please tell us the story of your first encounter with racism in higher education.
I would like to say something very similar to that what Phil said, because we normally think that racism is something which happens sometimes when we are confronted with very extreme cases, when, for example, people are hitting someone on the street and something like that, when we have some pogroms and something like that. But racism in the structural way is an everyday life experience. And since I was a child, I come from Peru, and in the Peruvian society, there is a very strong racial frame in which indigenous people are considered to be not able to think or to be civilized. And I think this is the first thing you learned as non-white person, that you are different, you are the other, you are not the normality. And this is someone you experience all your life in the school, in the university, and also in the academic world when you begin to teach, for example, as my case, a Peruvian guy who is teaching in a very black society like Austria.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's go on then to our first roundtable, which is music theory and the white racial frame. I am going to now put the link to that article written by Professor Ewell in the chat room. If you'd like to access it, it's right there available for everybody. Professor Ewell, in 2020, you wrote the article Music Theory and the White Racial Frame, the abstract to which states, quote, "For over 20 years, music theory has tried to diversify with respect to race, yet the field today remains remarkably white, not only in terms of the people who practice music theory, but also in the race of the composers and theorists whose work music theory privileges." In this paper, A Critical Race Examination of the Field of Music Theory, I try to come to terms with why this is so. I posit that there exists a white racial frame in music theory that is structural and institutionalized, and that only through a deframing and then reframing of this white racial frame will we begin to see positive racial changes in music theory. End quote. In music theory, the white racial frame, you denounce systemic racism that permeates your field and call not only for more scholar diversity, but you appeal to your colleagues to acknowledge that they are working for a racist institution. Please tell us about the white racial frame and what could be gained by deframing and then reframing.
Yeah, again, I have to take issue with the ending part of what you just said, that I say to my colleagues, you're working for a racist institution. I, of course, have never said that because I don't say the word racist. That's a little bit of editorializing on your part, Simeon, and I don't blame you for that. I'm just stating a fact. I don't say that they're working for a racist institution, and I don't really even speak that much about systemic racism. I definitely speak about white racial framing because that is how music education has been conceived of in the United States and certainly in Austria as well. I think one of the most important parts of the work that I've been doing over these last several years is understanding that the classical music that we teach, I myself am a cellist. I played for 50 years and I played all the repertoire out there, everything. Haven't played Prokofiev Symphony Concertant. That's a hard piece, but I could have. I just didn't pick it up. I probably could not now. My chops aren't that as good as they were 20 years ago, let's say. But I think one of the hardest things, especially for a crowd in Vienna, would be in understanding that the classical music that we put forth to our students is not inherently better than other musics on planet Earth. We perpetrate a falsity by telling our students that Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart and Haydn and Schumann and Chopin actually wrote better music than anyone else, and that they represent the highest level of musical humanity on planet Earth. They do not. It's extremely important to state that very bluntly, right? Now, because so many conservative people out there who are usually, but not always, white men, very much want to defend the status quo, they will immediately make this a zero-sum game and say, Philip Ewell wants to cancel Beethoven, or Philip Ewell wants us to stop singing Schubert's song cycles, or stupid things like that. No, I do not. I happen to love Schubert. He wrote two great trios. I played them both, B flat major, E flat major. They're beautiful pieces of music, although the fourth movement of the E flat major Schubert trio is too long. He put in some cuts at the end of his life. Take the cuts if you're going to play that piece. But I will say that without acknowledging it, we put this music forth and tell our students it's better and that they themselves are deficient if they can't understand this. And that is just horrific. It's horrific. It has to stop. That's what I say I want when I say reframing. What I'm essentially saying is I want to dismantle the structural whiteness plus maleness because those two things have always been tied right at the hip, right? Whiteness plus maleness. In other words, the ideologies, white supremacy and patriarchy, right? Which is what my country has been founded on since it was founded in 1776. And if we simply can reframe our brains and yes, dismantle the structures that say that knowing German language is more important than knowing, I don't know, Hausa or Tagalog, for example. Are like, oh yeah, because of Brahms and Mozart and all the German. Well, yeah, that's fine. I don't have a problem with German language. I know some German. I know 5 languages, as a matter of fact. I lived in Russia for 7 years of my life, and I'm a fluent Russian speaker. You wouldn't know it by looking at me, but I am. And my mother was from Norway, so my Norwegian's pretty good actually. But at any rate, that sounds like I'm sounding immodest, and I hate that. But I want to just say to the listeners and the viewers that this is not about a monolingual American who doesn't understand anything about anything. No, no, no. This is about a person who's been very invested in classical music for my entire life. Well, since I was 9, I'm 59 now, so 50 years, let's say. I was 9 when I started playing the cello, who absolutely now has come around and understand that there's no reason to say that Johannes Brahms's music is better than Nathaniel Dett's music. He was a Canadian American, a black composer. There's no reason to say that Igor Stravinsky's music is better than Julia Perry's music. She was a black woman in America who died about the same time that Stravinsky did. There's no reason for me to say that György Ligety's music, he was Hungarian, right, is better than Chen Yi's music, who is a Chinese woman who still is alive and well and teaching at a university in Missouri, actually. It's just nonsense to put all those people, the William Shakespeare's, the Michelangelos, right? The Pablo Picassos, up on that hallowed hilltop. It's nonsensical. And we absolutely must realize that they were just people doing what they did, sometimes very nicely, very beautifully, but they were not inherently better. The reason they were put up there, and I'll finish with this, is because of the white supremacist patriarchies that put them there in order to enshrine their own power. It's about power ultimately.
Professor Mendívil, I imagine you'd like to say something.
I completely agree with Philip, and I would like to add something that this is possible. This racial frame begins with a canon, with implicity of a canon. And if you see who belongs to this canon, you can see that all are white men. And the same when you begin to teach. For example, when I was studying musicology in Germany, 90% of our professors were male and white. And you learned as student that the normality is to teach when you are white and you are man, you know. And this performativity of the canon builds an imaginary for you, and you begin to reproduce that because you think this is the normality, you know. And I think this is the point. We have to reframe this idea that there is something like a canon, and that this canon is something eternal or magic, is also or is only a historical fact, an historical fact which is related to the power structures in the world, you know, and with
And
colonialism.
if I could follow up on Julio's great point there, the word canon, well, where does that come from? It comes from the Catholic Church, right? Let's just be clear about that.
Absolutely.
As does 5-line staff notation and note heads and stems and beams and 4/4 time signatures. That's Christian coming from the Catholic Church. So the very idea that we're talking about the canonization of a composer, well, that has everything to do with Christianity. I'm an atheist, proud, happy, lifelong atheist. And my mother was a Christian and she was the best person on the planet. So there's that. I think it's really important to speak very clearly and say what we are teaching our students in universities and higher ed is the legacy of the classic of the Catholic Church music version, right? The fact that 100% of so-called canonized composers were in fact both white and male, well, that just says it all, right? That says, we don't need to discuss it anymore. It's not a coincidence. It's not just that, oh, well, they just happen to be the best composer. That's just silly. Anybody who says that or thinks that, that's just very silly, and I don't even want to have that conversation. It has to do with white supremacy and patriarchy. In the United States, I would add, there's a very strong component today of Christian nationalism, and this is also in music, right? And the last two things, if there's a five-leg stool, the last two things in teaching music in the United States would, of course, be Germanism and pianism, right? The piano and the German language and culture, right? Again, I'm going to highlight here. I am not saying that those things are musically bad. No, no, no. I happen to love Brahms, for example. He has two sonatas for just for me, just for cello. I love them both. And I every time I get to play a Brahms symphony is one of the best days of my life. I played all four of them on many occasions. So there's that. But I just want to highlight the fact that we have been putting this forth. And in 2025, with the world as interconnected as it is with social media and everything, it just doesn't make any sense at all anymore. And I do believe that a lot of conservative voices in classical music understand this, and they're fighting it in very, very surreptitious or very, very sly ways. What they won't do is say things as bluntly as I have, even though they know them to be true.
So I'd like to slow down. We have two professors, at least two professors here. I know we have many more doctors. So we're going to go into now Professor Mendivil's article. And Professor Mendívil, I'd like you to, again, explain a little bit more about this music education normativity. Professor Ewell just explained the canon, what that means exactly. So I'm going to read first the first roundtable, and then perhaps you could kind of back up and explain a little bit more go into more detail so that we're all following you 100%. At least so I can follow you 100%. So this is the slide. There it is, full screen.
In this text, I try to
But
reflect.
Professor Mendívil, I'll read first, if possible. So this is the roundtable Disobedient on Normativity and Canon Formation in Music Ethnomusicology. Professor Mendívil, in your 2023 article, and the following are my translations to English from the original German, Disobedient on Normativity and Canon Formation in Ethnomusicology. You take us on your personal journeys into music. Whereas music is supposed to be, quote unquote, immaterial or disembodied, your experiences have shown you that music is very, very much about the body, and a body that is not yours. Quote, I'm reading here my translation again from the original German. I'd like to emphasize that I'm not writing on behalf of German-speaking music, not even on my behalf, but on behalf of the different I's that have lived in me throughout my life as a migrant, some of which still do. A former musicology student from Peru, a young teacher at German universities who aspired to a career in Latin America, a professor for music ethnomusicology at German universities, the chair of ethnomusicology in Vienna, who can fulfill the institution's statutory quota, and, of course, the immigrant who every day lives through BIPOC microaggressions in and outside the academic world. I'm writing from this dark body, from the body of an other, meaning from body material that differs from the bodies surrounding me in my academic environment, writing from a body that, under any other circumstances, wouldn't be suitable for taking part in German ethnomusicology, end quote. Professor Mendívil, what on earth has led you to write such sad words?
Oh, I would say my experience in these countries, as well in Germany as in Austria. And I want to emphasize that when I speak about the relationships between the bodies, I am trying to say that musicology is a discipline which has not only to do with theories or with methods, but also with normal practices as, for example, to speak with one colleague in our institute, and all these kind of everyday life situations are completely influenced by our racial relationships, you know. And I can notice, so for example, the first time I was in the front of white students, they didn't realize that I was the teacher in the classroom because they are not prepared to have a non-white professor, you know. And I think this is a very important point, that we are thinking all the time that musicology is only discipline which has to do with ideas, which has to do with some theories, but musicology is also a discipline we have to do with practices. Every day you have to greeting people in here and there. You are related to some persons and you differentiate between who is or who belongs to your group and who doesn't belong to your group, you know. And I can experience that in many ways. When I notice I am being excluded from some situations because I am the other, I have other language and I have other customs, and I don't know, the people sometimes imagine something about you and position themselves in front of you because of your appearance, you know. And I think this is a very, very everyday life experience in musicology. I see all people around me are white people, and I am the only one in the completely German-speaking area. I am the only one who has a chair position in ethnomusicology and is a not white person. And I think
Professor
this is
Mendívil, and yeah, I wanted to ask you about that extraordinary statement that you make, that indeed you are this chair of this department, not because you're the best, but you believe that they hired you because they needed to fulfill this quota. What makes you think that?
uh, it's very difficult to me to say that because I don't know. I didn't decide to take the position. They give me the position and I have it. But I would say that you can, if there is some quotes, you cannot get a position without some work after. You have you have to, you have to show what you can in your discipline. But in my experience, I would say, or I can say that many times I have had the impression that I have to be better, two times better, so twice better than everyone here because I was not German and I was not white, and I had to demonstrate that I am the best, you know. And this was very clear for me that I was in a very special position because I have to demonstrate something which is, I would say, normal for the others, you know.
If I could jump in and add on that, Simeon, it's extremely important. I would probably say that Julio may have been offered a job, because of his positionality, but I would also say he's probably the best also, right? Those two things are certainly not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, yeah.
From my own experience, I would also say 2 times better. I'd say it's probably more like 8 or 10 times better, Julio, that we have to be than our white counterparts. And there are two very important aspects to a position like Julio's in Vienna, mine here at Hunter College to a less extent, because I do have colleagues in my music department who are not white, as most, it's in New York City, so that's almost, it's certainly going to happen. This we call representation, right? And representation is very important because you can begin to understand different perspectives when you get together to do committee work or make decisions collectively in a shared governance type of way. But there's another part of that's apart from representation, and it has a lot to do with what I was saying before, which was like letting go of the false belief that Beethoven wrote the best music in the world. That has to do not with representation, it has to do with self-reflection. A person looking in the mirror at themselves and saying, "Now hang on, that jerk Philip Ewell said something, but by golly, yeah, he's a jerk. Okay, fine. I'm not going to comment on my own jerkitude here, but I will say that looking in the mirror and saying to oneself, I myself actually believe that Beethoven is better, and it does have something to do with his whiteness and his maleness. That's a really very bitter pill to swallow. I actually believe that Shakespeare was the best English language writer who ever lived. And then to admit to yourself that it has to do with whiteness and maleness to one extent or another, that's very difficult to do. I know because I've done these things myself. Shakespeare died in 1616, folks. Do you not think it's time to let other English language authors, to give them a little, other playwrights, to give them a little bit of oxygen? It's extremely important for individuals to do this work themselves. This is not about representation, right? If Julio's all white colleagues were able to look in the mirror and at themselves and admit these things, they could do a lot. They could move a lot in a positive direction without representation. So there really have to be both things. And a lot of my work recently is really focused on the second one. Yes, representation, please, by all means. I mean, we have a New York Philharmonic has 104 players right now. There's one black person. The principal clarinet, Anthony McGill, he's the one black person in the New York Philharmonic, which was founded in 1842. It happens to be our oldest symphony orchestra. The first woman to be contracted was Steffi Goldner in 1922, 80 years after it was formed. And the first black person to play contracted, not just substituted, was Sanford Allen in 1962. That was 120 years. Sanford Allen is still alive, the black violinist, the first one to play in the New York Philharmonic. So representation absolutely matters there. There is none, and there should be. Oh, and let me just make a point. When people say, oh, we would have loved to have these people in the orchestra, but there were no qualified candidates, that is always a lie. It's just not true. It's either a lie or ignorance. I shouldn't say lie necessarily because somebody might actually not know, but it's never true. So I would point to John Thomas Douglas, virtuoso violinist who wanted to play with the New York Philharmonic. He was born in 1847. His mother was a slave at the time. He was able to get freedom. His mother was, they were manumitted, and he went to Germany and France, studied in Dresden and Paris, came back to New York, and he was a virtuoso violinist who taught David Manis, who was a very famous violinist here in New York, who started the Manis School of Music, as a matter of fact. And I'm getting this information from David Manis's autobiography. If you're interested, that is called Music is My Faith, David Manis. So there were always women and non-white people who could have been playing, who could have been professing as a professor. Always, always. Never believe that. It's just not true. I used to say, oh, maybe it's not true. You know, maybe that. No, I speak very bluntly these days because I know too much, right? It was never true that there were no other playwrights in the 18th century England who were not both white and male. Of course there were. There were probably women of color even in England. There certainly were white women, no question about that. But we don't know their names because of patriarchy. That's why we don't know their names. It's very important to think about both representation, which is what Julio's answer was focusing on, and then the self-reflection and just the intellectual arguments that one must have with oneself in order to let go of the falsities of white supremacy and patriarchy.
Okay, so before we
I
get
would
into our
say
final
that,
part, yes, Professor Mendívil.
and I would say that even in the case that there are not people who is able to to get such a job, the the question is why?
Mhm.
Why our discipline made not possible for these people to get a position, you know? And I completely agree with Philip. This is not um, this is a kind of policy which is uh, hidden, but is working all the time and saying you there are not people who is able, but the same at the same time the system is trying to uh, cancel a lot of people who don't have the possibility to get some jobs, you know.
Absolutely. A very quick vignette here would be from the Peabody Institute of Music, which opened in 1857. It happens to be the United States' oldest music institute, training conservatory. It's very fine. It's in Baltimore. Um, the first black student they allowed was Paul Brent. That was in 1949, so 92 years after it opened. And there was a huge back and forth among the board of directors that was dug up by a wonderful young woman. Her name is Sarah Thomas. She's a white woman, a violinist, and she wrote a master's thesis on this person only about 3 or 4 years ago. I read it. It's great. And I ended up talking to her and on Facebook and other places. And I just would like to point out that exactly what Julio just said. It took Peabody 92 years, and in one letter that she transcribed, um, the chair of the board of directors of Peabody wrote to the other directors on the board. We have now come face to face with whether we are going to admit Negro students or not. And it's what's important here is to note that it wasn't in the bylaws. It very rarely is, right? Sometimes it is in the United States. We have the Three-Fifth Compromise. We have different court rulings. Dred Scott, 1857. Hey, the same year of Dred Scott is the court ruling. I don't know if there are people overseas on this call. But Dred Scott was the ruling of the United States Supreme Court 7-2 decision that said black people can't be citizens and they never will. What the Supreme Court didn't know in 1857 was that they were essentially starting the Civil War. Okay, so the final point, Paul Brent, 1949, he was able to get in as a pianist to Peabody. They had literally had a blanket denial of any black people coming to Peabody for 92 years. That's the history of the United States that we need to confront as
Um,
we reframe these issues.
So before we go into the final section of our show tonight, I'd like to ask, are there any questions? Would anyone else like to share a story of racism, of some kind of exclusion? We've heard, of course, from the two professors here. We'd love to have some additional people chime in if they have anything they would like to contribute to the conversation. Hi, Dr. Davis.
There you go. Oh,
Hi. Dr. Davis, we can't hear you right now.
is that better?
Now we can hear you. Hi.
Oh, good. I want to thank you for your comments, both of you, professors. I found it very enlightening. I did not know a third of what you said, if not a half, and it was well said and well brought out. I played in orchestras in the past on my violin, but I'm really not a violinist, that I know. I used to do solo work with an accordion, and that's way beyond my age limit now. In any case, what you said is true. It's all over the place, and you really brought it out so that we could all see it and hear it. There's a group of people that's supposed to be here today, but which I invited, and somehow or other, no one showed up. I don't understand why. But in any case, keep up the good work, gentlemen, and keep in touch with Sim. He'll bring you back, I'm sure.
Thanks,
Thank you
Dr.
so much for
Thank
that.
you so much. Yeah.
Thanks for those comments.
Thanks, Dr. Davis. So we will now go into our final section of the conversation, and I'm putting this in the chat room. There's a link here to one of the articles. It's right there. So I'm going to read, and please do bear with me. I'm reading two excerpts from two different articles. So this is a little bit lengthy. Thank you very much for bearing with me on this. And here is the first article. The title of this roundtable is "A Dream or a Nightmare?" Classical music organizations, especially in the United States, are no strangers to the concept of white racial frame. The New York City-based Chamber Music America has put the focus on removing the white racial frame as more important than promoting classical chamber music, the classical chamber music genre in society. And I'm reading from their quote, "Commitment to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion," which states, "The Board of Directors has made diversity, inclusion, and equity a primary focus of CMA's work. While we have a commitment to improve in the area of diversity, inclusion, and equity, we realize that Chamber Music America was born from the Western European classical tradition, which evolved within a society that practiced many forms of racism and exclusion, some of which continue today to impact our members and communities. We further recognize that the people and music of the ALAANA, that is African, Black, Latinx, Asian, South Asian, Arab, Middle Eastern, and Native American communities, must represent a greater portion of the organization in order for Chamber Music America to be a relevant part of a broad cross-section of contemporary society. It is our view that at this particular time, and because of this history, race continues to be a uniquely privileging or penalizing category for many communities. We will, therefore, conduct our diversity, inclusion, and equity work focusing on ALAANA people and approach other issues of diversity, including LGBTQ, gender, or abilities through a racial lens. This means that we will prioritize the involvement of these communities that are also part of the ALAANA community in order to directly focus on race, which we believe to be the clearest and most urgent issue affecting our field," end quote. And it should be noted that when I checked for that article, that I had what we are seeing here was accessed in 2022. It is no longer available on their website. It seems to have been removed. And I continue to the second article, which I shared with you in the chat room. Whereas Chamber Music America beholds the racial reframing as a dream, political scientist Francis Fukuyama beholds a nightmare. In his article, "Against Identity Politics in Foreign Affairs" in 2018, Fukuyama writes, quote, "By turning a spotlight on narrower experiences of injustice, identity politics has brought about welcome changes in cultural norms and has produced concrete public policies that have helped many people. The Black Lives Matter movement has made police departments across the United States much more conscious of the way they treat minorities, even though police abuse still exists. So there's nothing wrong with identity politics as such, but the tendency of identity politics to focus on cultural issues has diverted energy and attention away from serious thinking about how to reverse the 30-year trend in most liberal democracies toward greater socioeconomic inequality. It is easier to include female and minority authors in college curricula than to increase the incomes and expand the opportunities of women and minorities across outside the ivory tower. Today's left-wing identity politics also diverts attention from larger groups whose serious problems have been ignored. Until recently, activists on the left have had little to say about the burgeoning opioid crisis or the fate of children growing up in impoverished single-parent families in the rural United States. But perhaps the worst thing about identity politics as currently practiced by the left is that it has simulated the rise of identity politics on the right. The right has notably adopted language and framing from the left, the idea that whites are being victimized, that their situation and suffering are invisible to the rest of society, and that the social and political structures responsible for this situation, especially the media and the political establishment, need to be smashed. Across the ideological spectrum, identity politics is the lens through which most social issues are now seen, end quote. First, Professor Mendívil and then Professor Ewell. One man dreamed just a few years ago that, quote, his 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Professor Mendívil first, and then Professor Ewell. Was that yesterday's dream?
I think you are mentioned a very important point, and for me, it's a kind of dilemma because I think we need, in some degree, we need identity politic, but on the other hand, I find very suspect every kind of identity because we don't have an identity. We have many identities, and a very important part of the racial frame is to give you a fixed identity, and you don't have an identity as not white person because we are, for example, Philip and I, we have a very different experience. We have very different backgrounds, and through this idea of identity, we were unified in an otherness, which are completely artificial, And for this reason, I see the point that we have some identity policies, and on the other hand, I think that is sometimes problematic to remark always that we have identity and the normal people don't have, because we are not we are not a unified person. We are many persons in different situations. And I know the same when I am speaking with you or when I am with friends or when I play music in Peru. We have different situations and we have different identities in our social frame, And I think this is the point for me. We have to defend our right to be like we want to be, but our identity is not one, but many identities.
Yeah.
Professor Ewell.
Yeah, exactly. We in fact have many identities, and we should not lose sight of that. And also, what Julio said is that there is a notion that among majoritarian populations in the United States, that's white people, and among those white people, men, because of their maleness, are not considered of certain identities. My mother was from Norway. She was a green card holder. She was not a U.S. citizen, right? And it's quite accurate for me to call her Norwegian, right? And as an ethnicity, a nationality, right? But she was also white. At any rate, you ended with a quote from Martin Luther King. I have a dream to live in a world where my 4 children are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. That's very famous from the I Have a Dream speech. I just want to point out that the title of the March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Okay, number one. It wasn't about a utopia that we should that you know is already here. Number two, Martin Luther King would vehemently deny that that actually had happened. And number three, he would vehemently deny that a common narrative on the right, which is as if we stop talking about race, then we will get to that place faster. That is categorically wrong, and he himself would have denied that. My father knew MLK. He graduated from Morehouse College with him in 1948. My father, John Ewell, actually. But I have to focus on Francis Fukuyama a little bit, if I could. He's conservative. He worked for the State Department under Reagan, and he wrote a book, his most famous book by far. It's called The End of History and the Last Man. It came out in 1992, in which he said, after the demise of the Soviet Union, liberal Western democracy won. It is the last type of government. It won everything. Nothing else is relevant. I just want to point out that Francis Fukuyama, who is in his early 70s now, was completely wrong about that. Fascism, authoritarianism, populism, not liberal Western democracy. He was wrong as wrong could be. Francis Fukuyama, who has a PhD from Harvard. He's not a stupid person. Oh, by the way, he's a Japanese American too, which only proves that non-white people can buy into white patriarchies quite happily. Clarence Thomas, goodness gracious. Again, if there are people overseas, he's a very, very conservative black Supreme Court justice here in the United States who is a very big fan of white supremacy and patriarchy. So I guess I would say if Fukuyama thinks that identity politics are wrong, they are definitely right. Because he's just really wrong in a lot of things he says, right? I mean, quod erat demonstrandum. I've just proven that identity politics are probably the right way to go if Fukuyama says they're the wrong way to go. The one last thing I would leave you with is when you say identity politics together as a word collocation, right? You are parroting a talking point of right-wing America, namely Christopher Rufo, and others, Stephen Miller or Donald Trump, for that matter. Okay, which is one reason I would never say personally identity politics the same way that I don't say the word racist. It's pointless. People stop listening when you say that. I sometimes use the word identities, but I usually will use the word positionalities, for example, where you're coming from. Oh, you're a queer person, a self-identified queer person. Okay, well then you have an LGBTQ perspective on things. That's great. Talk to me about that because I want to learn about it. I'm not a queer person. I'm a straight cisgender man, and with that comes quite a bit of privilege, and I know that. Ask me how many times I've been groped on a dance floor. Right there. That's how many times. And I've been to gay clubs before. That was a joke. Okay, sorry. At any rate, at any rate, Fukuyama and his identity politics, that is nonsense. It's not, I'm not saying, Simeon, it's nonsensical for you to bring it up. I'm glad you did. I'm saying it's nonsensical to think that the last bit that you mentioned there on Fukuyama was that right-wing people are blaming the rise of what right-wing identitarians can be blamed on the LGBTQ and indigenous folks and and Jewish folks and Muslim folks for talking about themselves, like, or me as a black person talking about, like, well, that's just blame the victim, isn't it? It's just blame the victim. In other words, the people on the right would have made those accusations whether there was a discussion about identity politics or not. That's irrelevant, actually. So don't use the term identity politics, please. Use the terms identities, speak about them, and push back against Christopher Rufo style nonsense in the best way you can. And I guess if I could leave the listeners with one thing, it's do some of that self-reflection. I think many people on the Zoom call have done exactly that. Keep doing it because we all need to self-reflect. Nobody's perfect, obviously, including Phil Ewell. I am racist and sexist and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic and transphobic, just like the rest of us, although I try to be less of that every day of my life by reading and educating myself and thinking about these things. I'm just being an adult about it and not saying, oh, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist. That's just silly. That's a child speaking. Okay? I'm not a child. So we should acknowledge that humans are flawed beings and we should think about living together with each other and not being so angry and hateful all the time. Unfortunately, as you all know, in my country, the United States right now, we've taken a very dark turn, but we'll make it through it somehow. We always have before, and who knows what's waiting for us on the other side. Let's all hope that it's something better than we had before.
Are there, and we have some applause there from some of the participants. So are there any questions, any comments at the moment? And we have a lot of applause actually. Are there any comments? Would anyone like to jump in at the moment? Otherwise, I'll move on in any case to the final question, first to Professor Ewell and then to Professor Mendívil. What do you wish all of us, Professor Ewell, the next time we think about classical music?
Well, yeah, the next time we think about classical music, yeah, I probably will be repeating some of the things I've said, but I will start with the positive, which is it's some really great, beautiful music. I'm on a little bit of a Jan Sibelius kick right now. Now, he wrote seven symphonies, right? Finnish composer, Jan Sibelius. I've only played number two, number five, and number seven of the seven symphonies myself. They don't get played that much, not nearly as much as Brahms or Beethoven. I've played all of those. Nine symphonies, Beethoven, four of Brahms. Beethoven symphonies, yeah, they're fine, whatever. They're okay. Brahms, yes, awesome. Jan Sibelius, even better. But nevertheless, I actually listen to classical music pretty rarely. If you're thinking about, classical music, the first thing I would want to leave the audience with is it's really some a great music. There's some th great things out there from Italian and German opera houses, and obviously many countries in Europe have given us classical music in the United States and other places in Mexico. Carlos Chavez. There have been, classical composers really all over the planet. Suk Chin in South Korea, for example, has written some very beautiful music. And I would just highlight that before I get into my like, now I have to bring you down a little bit. And to simply say the next time you think about classical music, just realize how deeply rooted it actually is in white supremacy and patriarchy, and how it has been used as a tool of oppression in many ways. Certainly in our music educational institutes, I know because that's what I do, right? And also outside, goodness gracious, Donald Trump in 2017 in Poland, when he was president, gave a speech where it was a white nationalist speech, basically, talking about Western greatness. And he claimed, we write symphonies. Now, he doesn't go to symphonies. Donald Trump doesn't listen to symphonies, but he knows that they represent white supremacy and patriarchy. That much he knows, right? Now, if Donald Trump knows that, well, we should at least, hey, say what you will about Donald Trump, but he's being honest with himself about that bit, right? Classical music represents whiteness and maleness and the ideologies that brought us the mythological concepts of whiteness and maleness, the twin ideologies, white supremacy and patriarchy. We cannot lose sight of that fact. And that doesn't mean we should stop doing this. I'm never going to stop playing classical music. No way. I like it too much. But I don't put it up on a pedestal and tell my students that the greatest composer who ever lived was Mozart. That's just silly. That's just not true. Because I don't know all the other music on planet Earth. Nobody does. The only way one person could, and I'll end with this, the only way a person could claim that Beethoven or Mozart or Bach was the greatest composer on the planet, which is nonsense you will hear, let's be honest. The only way you could claim that is if you believe in two things, white supremacy and patriarchy. If you actually believe in those things, then you might actually say something like that. You might actually say that. And if you do, you have to be honest with yourself and admit to yourself that to an extent, you believe in the tenets of white supremacy and patriarchy. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but swallow it you must if that's what you think. I hope that I can entice people to think about these things such that they'll acknowledge it and then pull back a little bit and then say, you know what? Let me give these other composers a listen. Let me give these other people a chance and rethink how I hear music. And I'll end with this uplifting note. It is exhilarating and emancipating. Believe me, it has been for me. And I've heard that from many people who have read my work and who have been inspired by my work, if I can be so immodest.
Professor Mendívil, you get the last word.
Yeah, I can only agree with Philip. I would say classical music is, of course, great music, but I think also very important to think that this music is reproduced and is maintained through a system which promote this music, you know? Isn't this music we say all the time is a music which is beside all cultures or is beyond all times, is a kind of eternal music. But there is a system which is supporting this music, is it supporting the reproduction of these imaginaries that classical music is better than other music cultures, you know? And I think the best point is to reinforce, the best point to reflect about it is just to reinforce what Philip said, what Philip told, that we have to be aware which position we assume when we say something like this is the most or the best composer all the times, because it's a positionality. What are you doing in this moment? And I think this is the point. We have to be aware what we are reproducing when we say some things like that, you know. Um, this is a great music, but music is not naive. There is also a political intention, political implications. The world order plays also a role in the definition of this music as universal music. And all these things are very important to reflect in order to reframe what we understand as classical music.
So let's
You're
see
here.
let's see how we can stay in touch with Professor Ewell. It's easy enough. It's philipewell.com. Professor Ewell, people can find your publications here that you were mentioning, and they can reach out to you under contact. Is that right?
Yeah, the contact just has a Gmail address. I'm happy to respond there. I just recently joined Blue Sky. If anyone's on Blue Sky, I left Twitter back when Elon Musk changed the little bird to an X, which I think is just a swastika without the four little winglets. So I I got off of that as I got off when the getting was good, right? But you can find me on Blue Sky. It's much better.
So feel free to reach out to Professor Ewell at philipewell.com. And Professor Mendívil, it's easy enough. It's juliomendivil.de. That's for Germany, DE, Deutschland. juliomendivil.de. Professor Mendívil, people can reach out to you if they have any questions and they can read your articles.
Yes. I am working on the page, and I will lay some articles there. Yeah, and people can contact me through my other sources.
Fantastic. So do reach out to Professor Mendívil at juliomendivil.de. So thank you so very much for such an intimate and enriching and inspiring conversation to Professor Philip Ewell and Professor Julio Mendívil.
Thanks for having us. This was fun.
Thank you very much.
So I'd just like to point out before we go that you can stay in touch with Vienna Live and find out about all upcoming shows at www.simeonmoro.com. And while you're at it, you can see here that you can sign up for the Friday greeting that I send out where I say, thank goodness it's Friday, and give exclusive insights into upcoming shows, tell people what's went on that week. All you have to do is put in your email and then click yes, I want email updates from Vienna Live. The website again is www.simeonmoro.com. Once again, thank you so very much to Professors Julio Mendívil and Philip Ewell. Thank you to Vienna Live sponsors Victoria and Frederick Mulligan. Thank you to Abby Moser, Allison Hull, Agnieszka and Benoit Yvolet, and Mary Schlesinger for their support of this show. Thanks to my cousin Mike, a marketer from Layer App. If you're an architect or an engineer, they have a really cool tool you should check out. And of course, thanks most of all to you, our participants, who make these 5 years and counting of Vienna Live worthwhile from Vienna, Austria, New York City, New York, and Washington, D.C. Goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.